Reid's mornings began with the muted drone of the city, a familiar thrum that vibrated through the floorboards of his small apartment. He was a creature of habit, his days a meticulously arranged sequence of tasks. The scent of bitter coffee filled his kitchen, a ritualistic comfort before he stepped into the predictable grind of his work. He managed inventory for a regional distribution center, a job that demanded precision and offered little in the way of surprise. He thrived on the order, the certainty of numbers slotting neatly into spreadsheets. His determination, a quiet, unyielding force, applied equally to balancing ledgers and ensuring his houseplants received the exact measure of water each week. One Tuesday, a thick, cream-colored envelope lay amidst the usual bills and flyers in his mailbox. It bore no return address, only a crisp, formal font that seemed out of place in his utilitarian world. Inside, the heavy stationery crackled with an unfamiliar gravitas. It was from a solicitor, a firm he'd never heard of, in a town he'd never visited. The letter informed him, with polite brevity, of the passing of a distant relative, a great-aunt named Elara Vance. Reid barely recalled the name, a faint whisper from a forgotten family tree. He had no memory of ever meeting her, his connection to her severed by generations of geographical and emotional distance. The letter then delivered its unexpected payload. Elara Vance had bequeathed to him her sole property, a secluded cabin nestled deep within the Blackwood Forest. A cabin. The word felt foreign on his tongue, a stark contrast to the sterile efficiency of his life. He read the details again. The property was remote, the solicitor's instructions for access bordering on an expedition. A sense of unease, faint but persistent, began to prickle at the edges of his ordered mind. It wasn't the logistical challenge that bothered him, but the sheer unexpectedness of it, the sudden, uninvited disruption. Why him? Why this cabin? The letter offered no explanation, only an address and a demand for his presence to finalize the transfer of deed. The decision to go was less a choice and more an inevitability. Reid's inherent determination, usually channeled into problem-solving, now focused on this new, peculiar task. He secured a week off from work, packed a single duffel bag, and exchanged his sensible city sedan for a rented all-terrain vehicle. The drive stretched for hours, the urban sprawl gradually giving way to undulating hills, then dense, oppressive forest. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the damp, earthy scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. The road narrowed, eventually becoming little more than a dirt track, rutted and overgrown. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The solicitor's directions, detailed as they were, had failed to convey the sheer isolation. Cell service vanished miles back, leaving him with only the hum of the engine and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. He passed a dilapidated structure, its wooden siding gray and peeling, a rusted antenna jutting skyward like a skeletal finger. A faded, hand-painted sign, barely legible, read, "Weather Station." It stood as a lonely monument to some forgotten purpose, a stark reminder of how far he'd ventured from the world he knew. As he drove deeper, the trees pressed in, their branches intertwining to form a forbidding archway. The air thickened with an unidentifiable smell, something ancient and cloying, like whetstone and forgotten secrets. A profound silence descended, broken only by the crunch of tires on gravel. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just isolation, it was a deliberate withdrawal, a place meant to be forgotten. Finally, the trees opened slightly, revealing a clearing. And there it was. The cabin. It wasn't grand, nor was it picturesque. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single stone chimney leaned precariously. A narrow porch, its planks warped and splintered, sagged under the weight of years. Reid cut the engine. This wasn't just a house, it was a relic, a silent sentinel guarding something he couldn't yet comprehend. He had come seeking answers about an unexpected inheritance, but as he stepped out of the vehicle, the cool, damp air pressing against his skin, he felt an undeniable certainty that he had stumbled into a question far more profound, and far more terrifying. The forest, silent and watchful, seemed to hold its breath. The city's muted drone had been replaced by the rustle of leaves, a whisper that seemed to anticipate his arrival. Reid had driven for hours, the familiar urban sprawl dissolving into winding country roads, then narrow, overgrown tracks that barely qualified as paths. He'd passed a dilapidated weather station miles back, its skeletal antenna reaching forlornly into the sky, a stark monument to forgotten purpose. It had been the last sign of anything resembling civilization, a marker of his deepening isolation. The cabin materialized through a thicket of pines, a dark, squat silhouette against the bruised afternoon sky. It was older than he'd imagined, timbers weathered to a deep, bruised gray, a stone chimney listing slightly like a tired sentinel. A profound quiet settled over the land, broken only by the creak of his truck's suspension and the distant call of an unknown bird. Unlocking the heavy oak door felt like breaking a seal. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth, old wood, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like forgotten copper. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. His breath plumed faintly in the cool air. This wasn't just an old house, it was a relic, a tomb of forgotten lives. He spent the first few days simply existing, trying to make the cabin habitable. He was determined to approach this inheritance with a pragmatic mindset. It was an old structure, prone to the quirks of age. The groans of settling timbers, the drafts that snaked through unseen cracks, the rustle of unseen creatures in the walls, all were explainable. One evening, as twilight bled through the windows, painting the cabin in shades of bruised purple and gray, Reid was in the kitchen, wiping down a grimy countertop. The floorboards above him creaked, a slow, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight. He paused, bucket in hand. Wind, he told himself. He dismissed it, turning back to the sink. The wrench was gone. Reid blinked. He'd placed it right there, the dull glint of metal still vivid in his mind's eye. He swept his gaze across the counter, then the small, splintered table beside it, then the floor. Nothing. A frown etched itself between his brows. He wasn't prone to misplacing things, especially not tools he'd just been using. He searched the tiny kitchen twice, his irritation growing. Finally, he found it tucked neatly beneath a stack of old, mildewed newspapers on a low shelf across the room, a place he hadn't even touched yet. It was illogical. Later that night, in the relative warmth of the living room, a book open on his lap, a new sound began. A faint, rhythmic scratching, originating from the wall behind the heavy stone fireplace. It wasn't the skittering of mice, this was slower, more deliberate, like a fingernail dragged repeatedly over a rough surface. He listened, straining. It would stop, then resume, always from the same spot. He told himself it was just an animal, perhaps a squirrel trapped in the chimney, though the sound lacked the frantic energy of a trapped creature. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the printed words, but the scratching seeped into his awareness, a subtle, persistent invasion. He closed the book, setting it aside with a sigh. For a fleeting instant, a deeper shade detached itself from the gloom, a formless ripple that vanished before his conscious mind could properly register it. He rubbed his eyes, attributing it to fatigue and the flickering firelight playing tricks. He was alone, deep in the woods, and his mind was probably conjuring things. Still, the seed of doubt, tiny and sharp, had begun to sprout. The next morning, while investigating a particularly stubborn draft in one of the back bedrooms, Reid noticed a loose floorboard beneath a heavy, dust-shrouded wardrobe. He knelt, prying at it with the claw of a hammer. It gave way with a groan, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside, nestled among dry leaves and spiderwebs, was a small, leather-bound journal. No title, no author. Just the worn, smooth leather and a tarnished brass clasp. He pulled it out, brushing away the debris. The paper inside was brittle, yellowed, and covered in a tight, spidery script. The ink faded to sepia. The first few pages were mundane, entries about weather patterns and crop yields, but as he flipped deeper, the language shifted. The entries grew erratic, the handwriting more frantic, interspersed with strange symbols he didn't recognize, geometric patterns, swirling lines, and what looked like crude, stylized eyes. One phrase, repeated over and over in increasingly bold, desperate strokes, jumped out at him from a crumbling page: "The pact demands." He stared at the ancient words, then around the silent, watchful room. They were something else entirely. A chill, far colder than the cabin's damp air, seeped into Reid's bones. They were something else entirely. He could feel it, a prickling sensation along his scalp, a sense of being observed by something ancient and patient. He walked to the window, pushing aside the grime-streaked curtain. The cabin felt like a solitary eye, watching the wilderness, and in turn, being watched back. Later that afternoon, the subtle became overt. He was trying to pry loose a stubborn floorboard in the main room, hoping to find a forgotten cache or a clue, when a low, resonant thrum began. It wasn't a vibration from the old house settling, nor the hum of an appliance. There were none. It was a sound that seemed to originate from within the very timbers, a deep, guttural note that vibrated through the soles of his boots. And then came the smell. It clung to the back of his throat, making his stomach churn. Reid dropped the crowbar with a clatter that sounded deafening against the pervasive hum. He backed away, his gaze sweeping the room, searching for a source, a trick of the light, a hidden vent. Nothing. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound seemed to resonate from inside his skull now, a part of him. This was something alive, something asserting its presence. He was not alone in the cabin. He spent the rest of the day in a frantic, almost desperate search. He tore through dusty boxes in the attic, rifled through mildewed books on crumbling shelves, and even pried open a hidden compartment in the hearth, revealing nothing but a handful of dried, brittle leaves and a rusted iron key too small for any lock he could find. His distant relative, the man who had owned this place, had been an enigma. A recluse, by all accounts, who had rarely left these woods. What had he known? What had he been guarding? Reid needed answers, and the cabin, for all its sinister offerings, was only giving him riddles. He remembered a vague mention from the estate executor about old local records, perhaps at the nearest town's repository. The next morning, Reid drove his truck down the winding, overgrown track. The nearest town was little more than a cluster of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of a forgotten highway. He found the weather station easily enough, a squat, concrete structure that looked like it had been dropped haphazardly into a field decades ago and then forgotten. Rust stained the corrugated metal roof, and a defunct anemometer stood sentinel on a pole, its cups long since seized by corrosion. A small, hand-painted sign nailed to a warped door read, "Local Archives and Historical Society, Inquire Within." He pushed open the heavy, creaking door. The interior was dim and smelled of dust, old paper, and something metallic, like stale rain. Shelves, crammed with binders and boxes, lined the walls, and in the center, an elderly woman with spectacles perched on her nose sat hunched over a large, leather-bound ledger, her fingers tracing lines of faded script. She looked up, her eyes magnified behind thick lenses. "Can Reid help you, young man?" he asked, his voice surprisingly strong. Reid introduced himself, explaining his inheritance and his desire to learn more about the property. "My distant relative. He lived out past the old logging road." Reid am trying to piece together some of the history of the land. The archivist nodded slowly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Ah, the Miller place. That land has a long story. We have old survey maps, property deeds, local gazettes." "Anything specific you're looking for?" Reid felt a jolt of hope. "Anything about the original owners, or any unusual incidents connected to the land?" Reid heard some old rumors about it being built on an ancient burial ground. The archivist gave a small, humorless smile. "Rumors have a way of sticking to that particular stretch of earth." She pointed him towards a shelf of oversized ledgers. "Start with the land deeds from the late 1800s. And there's a box of old newspaper clippings under the table, marked Local Curiosities. You might find something in there." Reid spent hours poring over the brittle pages. The air in the weather station was still, the only sound the rustle of paper and the occasional sigh from the archivist. He found the deed to his cabin's land, dated 1897. It was unremarkable at first glance, detailing acreage and boundaries. But then he noticed a small, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the parchment in the margin, next to a detailed drawing of the cabin's footprint. It was a crude, angular spiral, unsettling in its simplicity. Below it, scrawled in faint, archaic script, were two words, "The Claim." He dug deeper, his fingers stained with dust and ink. In the box of Local Curiosities, he found it, a brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping from 1903, a family of four, who had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind an untouched meal on their table and no sign of struggle. The hum he'd felt in the cabin seemed to echo in his ears now, faint but persistent. The claim. The site of communion. The pieces, fragmented and terrifying, were beginning to align. And now, so had Reid. It was real, ancient, and it was waiting for him to uphold his end of a bargain he didn't even know existed. Reid's gaze remained fixed on the newspaper clipping, the faded ink of the headline screaming in unspoken terror. The claim. The site of communion. The words resonated with a sickening familiarity, echoing the low, persistent hum that had become a constant companion in the cabin. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pressure, a thrumming against his eardrums, deep in his chest. This wasn't just a derelict building, it was a crucible. He was no longer just curious, he was determined. He had to understand. The cabin itself felt watchful, its aged wood breathing around him. He started his search methodically, beginning in the study where he'd found the clipping. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, like old blood, subtle but persistent. Nothing. Moving to the master bedroom, the atmosphere grew denser. Here, the hum was almost audible, a low throb. He pulled out drawers, sifted through the few remaining garments in the wardrobe, then knelt to examine the floorboards. He pressed, then pushed, and with a soft groan of aged timber, a section of the floor lifted. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, lined with brittle, yellowed cloth. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves and dust, was a heavy, leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with a familiar, unsettling symbol, the spiral. The journal was thick, its pages filled with elegant, looping script. He carried it back to the study, settling into the worn armchair, the journal heavy on his lap. The first entries detailed mundane observations about the cabin, the beauty of the forest, the solitude. But as Reid turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, the lines less even. Dates jumped, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Then, he found it. An entry marked nearly a century ago, written by an ancestor whose name he barely recognized, a name that mirrored his own. The land demands its due. The pact, sealed by blood and earth, must be honored. The ancient ones sleep, but their hunger is eternal. We built upon their resting place, and for our trespass, we offered sustenance. My grandfather, his father before him, they understood. The claim is not a request, it is a primal right. This cabin, this very ground, is the nexus. It is not haunted by a spirit, but bound to an entity woven into the soil, the roots, the very stone of this place. It is the land itself, awakened, demanding its tithe. Reid's breath hitched. The hum in the cabin intensified, vibrating through the floorboards, up the legs of his chair, into his very bones. He felt a growing pressure behind his eyes, a phantom weight on his chest. He flipped more pages, finding increasingly desperate entries. The offering was not enough. It hungers for more. This wasn't just a ghost story, it was a generational curse, a horrific bargain. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land, and the cabin was its mouth. And his family, his lineage, was the ongoing payment. He needed more. He needed something, anything, to corroborate this madness. His mind raced. He remembered an old, faded map he'd seen earlier, tucked into a drawer in the kitchen. On it, marked with a small, hand-drawn circle, was the location of a local weather station. Maybe there, he could find something, an independent record, a local elder who knew the true history of this cursed place. Leaving the journal open on the table, its spiral symbol seeming to pulse faintly, Reid grabbed his keys. He drove, the gravel crunching under his tires, the forest a wall of silent, watchful trees. The hum, though fainter now, still resonated in his ears, a promise of what awaited his return. The weather station was a squat, utilitarian building, tucked away on a small rise overlooking a clearing. Its metal instruments whirred and spun in the crisp air. Inside, a lone figure, an older woman with kind but weary eyes, sat behind a desk, surrounded by stacks of old charts and binders. "Can I help you, son?" she asked, her voice raspy, like dry leaves. "I'm Reid. I've inherited the old cabin, deep in the woods. I'm looking for some information. Old records, perhaps." Anything about the history of the land, specifically. The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. That old place, she murmured, her gaze distant. Been in your family a long time, hasn't it? Generations. She paused, then looked directly at him, her gaze piercing. There are stories, you know. Stories about that land. About what was there before the cabin, before your people built on it. She reached for a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth with age. The old records here, they don't just track the winds and the rains. They track other things. Things that stir beneath the soil. Your ancestors, they knew. They made a bargain. To appease what sleeps, what hungers, they offered. A claim, they called it. The journal, the headline, the hum, the ancient pact. It was all real. The entity wasn't just tied to the land, it was an intrinsic, malevolent part of it, and his family was bound to it. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless, terrified, and utterly alone in the face of a horror that stretched back further than he could possibly imagine. The journal lay open on the warped kitchen table, its brittle pages illuminated by the single, sputtering oil lamp. Reid felt a cold, crushing weight settle upon him, not just in his chest, but pressing down from the low ceiling, pushing in from the rough-hewn walls. The hum. The ancient pact, the twisted lineage, it was all real. He needed to leave. The thought was a desperate, primal scream in his mind. But as he pushed back from the table, the old wooden chair scraped across the floorboards with a shriek that seemed to echo, not just in the small cabin, but inside his skull. The air thickened, growing heavy and still. Reid's stomach clenched. He walked towards the door, his movements stiff, as if wading through unseen currents. His hand reached for the rough iron latch, but before his fingers could close around it, a sharp, cracking sound ripped through the silence. It came from the wall beside the door, a sudden splintering like dry bone snapping. A hairline fissure, barely visible a moment before, snaked its way up the timber, widening imperceptibly, shedding fine dust onto the floor. Reid froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the crack, then slowly, cautiously, looked around the room. This wasn't just a draft, or an old house settling. This was deliberate. He forced his hand to the latch, twisted it, and pulled the door open with a groan of stressed wood. The night air, usually crisp, felt oddly viscous, clinging to his skin like a shroud. The trees loomed, their branches weaving a dense canopy that swallowed the moon. The path, which had seemed clear enough by day, was now a twisting, treacherous ribbon of roots and uneven earth. His only hope, a desperate, irrational one, was the old weather station. It was a relic, long abandoned, but it had a sturdy structure, and rumor had it, an old, hand-cranked radio for emergencies. If nothing else, it was a destination, a point in the vast, consuming wilderness that wasn't the cabin. He pushed through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his clothes, his heart hammering against his ribs. A wave of relief, thin and fragile, washed over him. He burst into the small clearing, gasping for breath, his lungs burning. The station itself was a squat, utilitarian building of corrugated iron and faded paint, nestled beneath the towering mast. It looked utterly desolate, but blessedly free of the cabin's ancient, suffocating aura. It eventually gave way with a protesting squeal. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of dust and ozone. Moonlight filtered through a grimy window, illuminating a cramped space filled with outdated equipment, flickering gauges, a map table covered in yellowed charts, and a large, imposing radio console. Reid moved directly to the radio, his hands trembling as he reached for the crank. He turned the crank, the gears grinding with a dry, metallic rasp. The console hummed to life, a faint, hopeful glow appearing on a dial. He adjusted the frequency, listening to the static, trying to tune past the white noise. Then, a sound cut through the static, not a voice, but a low, sustained hum. It was the hum. The same resonant thrum that had plagued the cabin, but here, it was clearer, sharper, as if it emanated from the very core of the weather station itself. Suddenly, the console sparked violently. A blue-white flash illuminated the room, followed by a shower of black smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Reid! Reid! He stumbled back, tripping over a stool, his head hitting the wall with a dull thud. The hum was everywhere, inescapable. It wasn't just the radio, it was in the walls, in the air, in him. As he scrambled to escape, his gaze fell upon a small, metal-bound box tucked away beneath the map table, half hidden by a loose floorboard. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress, he pulled it out. It was a sturdy, old first aid kit, but inside, beneath dried bandages and expired antiseptics, lay a rolled-up parchment. He unrolled it with shaking hands. It was a hand-drawn map, crudely sketched but detailed, showing the layout of the forest. And on it, marked with a stark, unsettling symbol identical to the one in the journal, was the precise location of his cabin. From the cabin, faint, almost invisible lines radiated outwards, converging on other points in the forest, each marked with a smaller, identical symbol. One of those points, circled in faded red ink, was the weather station. It had reached here. It was everywhere. The weather station, his desperate hope for escape, was just another node in its sprawling, unseen network. He was trapped, not just within the cabin, but within its very domain, a prisoner in a forest that was slowly, inexorably, becoming a part of the horror itself. The cold seeped into Reid's bones, a chill far deeper than the autumnal air. He stood amidst the humming machinery of the weather station, a metal box perched precariously on a rocky outcrop, overlooking an endless canopy of skeletal trees. The previous chapter's ending echoed in his mind. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin. It had reached here. He wasn't just trapped in the cabin, he was trapped within a sprawling, unseen network, a prisoner in a forest that was slowly, inexorably, tightening its grip. Despair, thick and cloying, threatened to swallow him whole. Yet, a stubborn ember of defiance flickered within him. He wouldn't simply surrender. Not yet. He moved with a frantic energy born of desperation. The weather station. It had to have a radio, some form of communication. His gaze darted around the cramped interior, past blinking lights and whirring fans, settling on an old-fashioned shortwave radio unit. Its dials were dusty, its casing scuffed, but it looked functional. A lifeline. His fingers, numb with cold and anxiety, fumbled with the knobs. He powered it on, a hopeful click echoing in the small space. The display flickered to life, bathing the console in a sickly green glow. He tried again, his movements growing more deliberate, more precise. He knew enough about these things to attempt a general distress frequency. Is anyone there? This is Reid, at the old weather station. I need help. I'm in the forest, near the old Kestrel Ridge cabin. Please, respond. He released the button, holding his breath, leaning closer to the speaker. The silence stretched, long and mocking. Then, a low hum began, not from the radio, but seemingly from the very air around him. It vibrated in his teeth, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, climbing up the metal structure of the station. The lights on the console flickered in sync with the sound, dimming and brightening like a dying heartbeat. This wasn't just interference. This was deliberate. Please. Reid am in danger. The hum intensified, coalescing into something more defined. It wasn't static anymore. It was a cacophony of sibilant breaths, wet rustles, and strained groans, like 1,000 insects writhing in a damp, confined space. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, pressing in on him. Then, a single, distinct sound cut through the chorus, the faint, unmistakable creak of the cabin's front door. He froze, his blood turning to ice. He was miles away, high up on the ridge. How could he possibly hear that? Was he imagining it? His eyes darted around the weather station, searching for an explanation, for a rational reason for the impossibility. There was none. The radio, however, continued its insidious broadcast. He recognized the sound. It was the same noise that had haunted the cabin, the same endless, rhythmic scrape that had driven him to the brink. The entity wasn't just blocking his call, it was broadcasting its own torment into his ears, mocking his desperate attempt for contact, showing him that it knew exactly where he was, and what he was trying to do. It could infiltrate and corrupt the very mechanisms of communication, turning his lifeline into a conduit for its own malevolence. The weather station, his last bastion of hope, was just another extension of its domain. The forest wasn't conspiring against him, it was the conspiracy, a vast, living trap. He was breathing in ragged gasps, his body trembling uncontrollably. He backed away, bumping into a shelf of meteorological instruments. A barometer clattered to the floor, its glass casing cracking. He barely registered the noise. His gaze was fixed on the small, grimy window of the weather station. Outside, the world had changed. The wind, which had been a gentle sigh before, now howled, carrying with it a faint, distant moaning sound. He could no longer trust his ears. He could no longer trust his eyes. The forest seemed to shift and writhe, its ancient branches twisting into grotesque, watchful faces. His mind, already frayed by sleepless nights and relentless torment, began to unravel further. There was no escape. Not here. Not anywhere within this forest. He was utterly alone, his desperate measures thwarted, his sanity teetering on the edge of a precipice. He had nowhere else to go. The weather station, once a symbol of hope, was now just a lonely, exposed cage within a much larger, more terrifying prison. He tore the plug from the wall, plunging the cabin into a sudden, jarring silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. He stood, breath catching in his throat, his gaze sweeping the familiar yet alien room. He felt watched, judged. The cabin was a trap, a cage closing around him. But running wasn't enough, he needed answers. The cryptic notes, the fragmented memories, the recurring symbol of the intertwined roots, they all pointed to something beyond mere haunting. He remembered the faded, hand-drawn map he'd found tucked into a forgotten drawer, marked with a single, circled WS and a series of almost illegible coordinates. Weather station. It had seemed innocuous then, just another relic of his distant relative's eccentricities. The canopy above was a solid black ceiling, blotting out the stars, leaving him to navigate by the thin beam of his light and the compass on his phone, its battery already dangerously low. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath his boots, sent jolts of adrenaline through him. He imagined eyes watching him from the impenetrable depths, ancient and patient. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing. And there it was, the weather station. It wasn't a modern structure, but a dilapidated, forgotten relic. A small, square building, its wooden siding warped and peeling, stood hunched and decaying. A rusted anemometer, frozen in time, pointed a skeletal finger at the sky. A broken satellite dish lay askew on the ground, swallowed by weeds. The windows were either shattered or boarded up with rotting planks, giving the entire structure a blind, vacant stare. A faint, cloying sweetness hung in the air here, like overripe fruit left to rot, mixed with the sharp tang of ozone. The air inside was still and heavy, thick with dust and the unmistakable smell of mildew and old paper. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a single room cluttered with archaic equipment, dials with shattered glass, rusted levers, charts yellowed and brittle with age. A desk, covered in a thick layer of grime, dominated one wall. He swept his hand across it, revealing a stack of leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and fragile. His fingers trembled as he picked up the top journal. The pages inside were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. It was his relative's hand, but the entries were disturbing, growing increasingly erratic over time. Then, tucked beneath the stack of journals, he found it. They were covered in symbols, intricate and alien, yet eerily familiar, the same intertwined roots he'd seen carved into the cabin's hearth. As he traced them, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanated from the stone. He found a journal entry, dated years ago, that explained them. His relative had deciphered fragments. It wasn't a ghost, not truly. It was an entity as old as the earth beneath the forest, a primal force tied to the land itself, a guardian spirit corrupted by neglect and a broken oath. Generations ago, his ancestors had made a pact, a solemn promise of reverence and sacrifice in exchange for the land's bounty, for protection from the encroaching wilds, for prosperity. The lineage was to provide a continuous offering, a life tribute at specific cycles of the moon and seasons, ensuring the entity remained benevolent, dormant, sated. But the sacrifices had stopped. The ancestors, driven by greed or fear, had faltered, then ceased the offerings entirely, hoping the entity would simply fade into legend. Instead, it had festered, growing starved and malevolent, twisting its protective nature into something possessive and destructive. The cabin, built on the very nexus of this ancient bargain, had become its anchor, its focal point. Reid's eyes scanned further, his breath catching as he read the final, horrifying revelation. The entity didn't want a sacrifice, it demanded the sacrifice. It was not content with appeasement, it sought to reclaim what was owed, to complete the cycle that had been broken. The lineage of sacrifice wasn't just a historical event, it was an ongoing obligation. And now, as the last living descendant, the burden, the demand, had fallen squarely upon him. The journal spoke of a final appeasement, a binding ritual that required not just a life, but the willing offering of a descendant, their spirit and essence to be absorbed into the very roots of the land, to replenish the entity, to renew the pact for another age. It was a terrifying, absolute surrender, a complete dissolution of self, a sacrifice that transcended mere death. It wasn't about saving himself, it was about fulfilling the ancient, monstrous debt of his bloodline. The choice was stark: offer himself, or watch the entity consume everything he held dear, twisting reality until there was nothing left but its ravenous hunger. He understood now. It wasn't trying to kill him, it was trying to claim him. Not as a victim, but as its final, ultimate offering. The silence, when it fell, was a physical weight, pressing against Reid's eardrums, echoing the frantic beat of his own pulse. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like a vacuum, sucking the very air from the cabin. He stood frozen, the radio cord still clutched in his hand, its severed plug a useless tangle against the floorboards. The residual dread from the spectral whispers clung to the air, a metallic tang on his tongue, a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the seeping cold. This was it. His hands, though trembling, moved with a newfound purpose. He dropped the cord and walked to the worn wooden chest in the corner, the one that had belonged to the distant relative. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten linens, lay the items he had meticulously gathered. A flickering oil lamp, its wick trimmed, ready. A small, tarnished silver bowl. He had found it tucked away in a sealed metal box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the dilapidated weather station on the northern ridge, a place the relative had used as a private, desolate repository. The relative's final, scribbled notes, discovered alongside the artifact, had been maddeningly cryptic, yet potent enough to steer Reid toward this desperate act. As he laid the items on the scarred dining table, the cabin groaned around him. Not the familiar creak of old wood settling, but a deeper, more resonant vibration, as if the very foundations were shifting. A faint, cloying scent, like damp earth and something long dead, began to permeate the air, making his stomach churn. He lit the oil lamp. This was the anchor, the relative's notes had implied, the physical manifestation of the pact. A low hum began to emanate from the walls, a frequency that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his chest, making his ribs ache. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, and his breath plumed in the air. He could feel the entity's presence now, no longer just a vague sense of unease, but a concentrated malice, pressing in from all sides. It wanted to break him, to wear him down before he could even begin. Reid focused on the wood. The relative's final scrawl had been clear, not to renew, but to sever. The blood binds, but the will unbinds. A sacrifice, not of flesh, but of lineage. He placed the wood in the silver bowl. The bowl immediately grew frigid, a thin layer of frost blossoming on its inner surface. The hum intensified, growing into a guttural moan that seemed to echo from the very heart of the cabin. The floorboards beneath his feet vibrated violently, rattling the windows in their frames. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "You seek to break what was given?" The voice was ancient, layered, filled with a hunger that made Reid's knees buckle. A gift for prosperity, a shield from ruin. Your line has thrived. A wave of images flooded his mind, generations of his family, from humble beginnings to modest successes. Fields yielding abundant harvests, children surviving harsh winters, small fortunes accumulated. He saw the relative, hunched over a desk, their face etched with despair, struggling with the same knowledge Reid now possessed. He saw a child, long ago, playing near the cabin, suddenly snatched into the earth, never to be found. The price paid. This was the reveal, the horrifying truth. The pact wasn't just a single event, but a continuous drain, a slow, insidious consumption of his lineage, ensuring their survival at the cost of periodic, brutal sacrifices. The sudden death of the relative was merely the latest payment. Reid wasn't just next in line for the cabin, he was next in line for the sacrifice. The entity's presence solidified into a crushing weight, pushing him down. The air grew thick, like breathing silt. But the relative's words resonated in his mind, not of flesh, but of lineage. Reid took a deep, shuddering breath. He reached for the flickering lamp, his hand shaking. The flame danced precariously. The ritual wasn't about appeasement, it was about rejection. He muttered the fragmented words from the relative's notes, a jumble of half-understood syllables that felt wrong on his tongue. As he spoke, the cabin's torment escalated. The floor tilted, throwing him off balance. Objects on the shelves crashed to the floor. The walls pulsed, seeming to breathe, to expand and contract. The voice roared in his head, a chorus of agony and fury. "You will not sever. You are bound." He focused on the wood in the bowl, on the ancient symbols carved into its surface. This was the anchor. This was the key. The relative's instructions had been stark, almost barbaric, a cleansing fire, a severing. He had to burn the anchor, break the physical link. He brought the lamp closer to the silver bowl, the heat radiating from the glass already making the frost on the bowl hiss. The entity recoiled, a shriek tearing through the cabin, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain and rage. It was a sound that seemed to rip the fabric of reality, shaking the very bones of the house, and Reid felt his own sanity teetering on the edge. The air screamed. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as a vision flashed through his mind, his own face, contorted in agony, melting away as the entity consumed him entirely. This was its last, most potent weapon, the fear of his own imminent demise. He would not be another link in the chain. He would be the end. With a resolute grunt, Reid inverted the lamp, pouring the burning oil over the ancient, inscribed wood in the silver bowl. Doubt his very existence. It wasn't just after a sacrifice, it wanted to become him, to absorb his identity into the endless chorus of Vance's, perpetuating its own horrific existence. Desperate, Reid stumbled, trying to find a way out. He slammed his fist against the bunker walls, futilely searching for another hidden mechanism, another passage. He tried to destroy the journals, tearing at their brittle pages, but they resisted, like ancient hide, and the symbols on the altar glowed with a faint, malevolent light, mocking his efforts. The bunker itself seemed to shift around him, the corridors twisting, doors appearing where there were none, then vanishing. He scrambled back to the passage leading to the surface, but it had changed. It was longer, narrower, the air thick with cloying sweetness that made his head spin. He could hear faint sounds from above ground now, not the wind, not the rustling leaves, but faint, mournful wails, like the cries of lost souls. His phone. He fumbled for it, needing to reach someone, anyone star. He found a brief, miraculous flicker of signal. He dialed the detective who had handled Elias's case, his fingers clumsy, his breath ragged. "Hello," he gasped into the phone, his voice barely a whisper. "Detective? It's Reid Vance." Elias Vance. The cabin. It's not what it seems. There's something here. Something ancient. It's trying to take me. There was a pause, a crackle of static. Then, the detective's voice, calm, almost dismissive. "Mr. Vance? You sound distressed. Are you all right? There's nothing unusual about that property. Elias Vance passed away from natural causes. Just an old man, alone in the lamp's flame, a fragile ember in the maelstrom, flickered against the encroaching void." Reid pushed, a guttural sound tearing from his throat, not just from his lungs, but from the raw, exposed nerve of his being. The carved wood in the bowl, warm and impossibly heavy, pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored the frantic drumming in his own chest. He poured his terror, his defiance, his desperate hope into it. The air, thick and cloying moments before, thinned, leaving behind an acrid scent of ozone and something ancient, like dust from forgotten bones. The cabin walls, which had writhed and groaned, settled with a series of sharp, splintering cracks. He stood there, trembling, the lamp still clutched in his hand, the carved bowl balanced precariously. The symbols on the walls, moments ago seeming to writhe, were now inert, etched into the timber, silent witnesses. He had done it. Or at least, he had pushed it back. The victory felt like ash in his mouth. The reveal, the terrible understanding that had solidified in the heart of the confrontation, was not a grand explanation, but a gnawing, insidious truth. The pact was not merely a bargain for power or land. It was a feed. A lineage, chosen and culled, to sustain something that existed just beyond the veil of perception, a hunger that transcended time and space. The cabin was not merely a location, it was an anchor, a tether to a world that had always been just out of reach, now terrifyingly close. He had severed that tether, for now, but the knowledge of its existence, of his family's complicity, was a stain on his soul. He had glimpsed the true face of the world, and it was a gaping maw. His legs, heavy as lead, carried him to the cabin door. The morning light, filtered through the dense canopy, seemed too bright, too innocent. The forest, once a place of deep, unsettling quiet, now felt simply. Reid didn't look back. He couldn't. The world felt muted, a dull echo of its former vibrancy. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, they were just sounds now, devoid of the rich tapestry of life he once knew. He was an observer, separated by a thin, invisible membrane. He knew he couldn't return to his old life, not truly. The man who had entered the cabin was gone, consumed and reforged in the crucible of its horror. Eventually, the faint hum of machinery drew him, not towards civilization, but to a small, isolated structure he had seen on an old map. The weather station. It was a dilapidated shack, tucked away on a small rise, surrounded by a tangle of forgotten instruments, a wind vane frozen mid-spin, an anemometer caked with rust, a rain gauge overflowing with dead leaves. The air here, though still carrying the scent of pine, also held a metallic tang, a strange counterpoint to the organic decay. He pushed open the creaking door. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the grimy windows. A single, ancient radio receiver sat on a scarred wooden table, its dials faded, its power cord chewed through by rodents. Here, at the edge of the known world, where humanity tried to measure and categorize the incomprehensible forces of nature, he felt a strange kinship with the forgotten instruments. They too were trying to make sense of something vast and indifferent, something that ultimately defied their neat measurements. He sat on a rickety stool, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of trees. The forest was silent, but he knew its silence was a lie. He had survived, yes, but he hadn't won. He had merely pushed back the tide, knowing it would eventually return. The entity was not vanquished, it was merely dormant, its hunger still a vast, unseen presence. The world had irrevocably changed for him. He saw the patterns now, the faint ripples in reality, the almost shapes in the periphery of his vision. He understood the desperate pacts, the desperate sacrifices. He was marked, an unwilling inheritor of a terrible knowledge, a custodian of a secret that would forever isolate him. He was free of the cabin, but the cabin was not free of him. He was alive, but the horror had not ended.